You're just a housewife. What would you know about running a business? The words hung in the air of our dining room as my husband's colleagues laughed uncomfortably. Little did Thomas know that I wasn't just making his dinner. I owned the very company that had just promoted him to CFO. The company whose financial reports he'd been bringing home for months, unknowingly giving me insight into every decision he and the board made. The company where tomorrow, in exactly 14 hours, I would walk into the executive boardroom and take my rightful seat at the head of the table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal glasses sparkled under our dining room chandelier as I placed the final touches on the table setting. This dinner party represented more than just a social gathering. It was Thomas's victory lap. After 12 years of climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian Technologies, he had finally secured the CFO position he'd been pursuing relentlessly. The guests tonight were his closest colleagues, the inner circle of executives who would now consider him a peer rather than a subordinate. I adjusted the name cards one last time, ensuring perfect spacing between the sterling silver cutlery I'd inherited from my grandmother. Presentation mattered in these circles. I knew that better than anyone, though Thomas and his colleagues remained blissfully unaware of exactly how well I understood their world. "Rebecca?" Thomas's voice carried from upstairs. "Are the Prescotts here yet? Gerald mentioned they might arrive early." "Not yet," I called back, smoothing the tablecloth. "Everything's ready when they are." Thomas appeared in the dining room doorway, adjusting his cufflinks, the platinum set I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. At 46, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, silver threading through his dark hair in a way that only enhanced his distinguished appearance, the very picture of corporate success. "You've outdone yourself," he said, glancing around at the immaculate dining room. "The board will be impressed." "That's the goal, isn't it?" I smiled, accepting his perfunctory kiss on my cheek. The doorbell rang just as I was lighting the candles. Thomas straightened his tie, his expression shifting into what I privately called his executive mode. Confident, slightly detached, perpetually amused by a world he believed he had mastered. "I'll get it," he said. "Just finish up in here." The next hour unfolded according to the careful choreography of corporate socializing. Gerald Prescott, Meridian's CEO, arrived with his wife, Catherine. They were followed by James Wilson, the operations director, and his husband, Daniel. Eliza Chen, head of legal, came alone as usual. The final guests were Marcus Reynolds, the outgoing CFO whose retirement had created the opening for Thomas, and his wife, Valerie. I played my role with practiced precision, the gracious hostess, the supportive wife. I served drinks, guided conversation through awkward pauses, remembered personal details about their children and vacation homes. All the while I maintained the gentle invisibility that these men unconsciously expected from their executives' wives, present enough to create comfort, invisible enough to allow them their illusion of importance. Dinner progressed smoothly through the appetizers and into the main course. The conversation, predictably, centered on Meridian's recent acquisition of a smaller tech firm and the integration challenges that lay ahead. The due diligence was flawless, Thomas said, accepting compliments on the financial analysis he had led. Their asset valuation was within 5% of our projections. "The anonymous investor group still concerns me," Gerald replied, cutting into his steak. "I prefer knowing exactly who owns what when we make these moves." I took a careful sip of wine, maintaining my pleasant expression. If only they knew that anonymous investor group had a name, a face, and was currently refilling their water glasses. "The Bellicore acquisition in 2019 went the same way," Marcus offered. "Sometimes these investment groups prefer to remain behind the scenes, as long as the money's good." And the money is exceptional, Thomas laughed, raising his glass. To healthy profit margins and mysterious benefactors who know a good investment when they see one. The men clinked glasses while I caught Eliza's eye briefly. She gave me the slightest nod, the subtle acknowledgement between women who understood more than they revealed. As Meridian's legal counsel, Eliza was one of only 3 people who knew my true role. We maintained our professional distance in these social settings, but the silent recognition was there. Rebecca. Catherine turned to me as the men returned. To discussing profit projections, Thomas mentioned you used to work in finance before you were married. How fascinating. Just briefly, I replied with practiced modesty. Nothing as impressive as what these executives handle. Still, Valerie joined in, it must give you some insight into all these business discussions. I can barely follow. When Marcus starts talking about quarterly projections. Thomas chuckled, overhearing this exchange. Rebecca's ancient history degree hardly prepared her for corporate finance. Her brief stint at an investment firm was mostly administrative. I felt rather than saw Eliza's subtle wince at Thomas's characterization. The familiar tightness formed in my chest, the same constriction I'd felt 15 years ago when Thomas first suggested I focus on creating our home rather than pursuing my own career. Now she manages our household with military precision, Thomas continued, his tone carrying that particular blend of affectionate condescension he'd perfected over the years. Budgets the household expenses down to the penny, don't you, dear? Someone has to, I replied lightly, drawing the expected chuckles. The conversation might have moved on naturally, but Gerald's next question shifted the evening's trajectory. Rebecca, what do you think of the Westfield merger proposal? Thomas mentioned bringing those reports home to review. Before I could formulate an appropriately vague response, Thomas laughed. Gerald, don't put her on the spot. Rebecca's talents lie elsewhere. You're just a housewife, darling. What would you know about running a business? The words hung in the air like suspended crystal, catching light from different angles. Catherine looked down at her plate. Marcus coughed slightly. Even Gerald seemed to recognize the comment had crossed a line. 15 years of carefully maintained composure nearly shattered in that moment. 15 years of watching Thomas take credit for insights I had casually suggested over breakfast. 15 years of strategic patience while I quietly built my empire through proxies and investment groups, including the anonymous investor that had recently acquired controlling interest in Meridian Technologies. I had planned to wait until tomorrow's board meeting for my revelation. Everything was prepared. The legal documents, the presentation, the official announcement. But sitting there, absorbing the sympathetic glances from the other women and the uncomfortable silence from the men, something shifted inside me. Actually, I said, setting down my wineglass with deliberate care, I do have some thoughts about the Westfield merger. Thomas's expression froze, his eyes warning me not to embarrass him. I ignored it. The proposed valuation is approximately 20% above market value, likely due to their overstatement of intellectual property assets. Their client retention metrics are concerning. They've lost 16% of their major accounts in the past 18 months, and their corporate culture issues are evident in their 34% staff turnover rate. I paused, meeting Gerald's surprised gaze directly. I wouldn't recommend proceeding without significant revisions to the offering terms. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking an alien language. Gerald's expression shifted from surprise to intense interest. Those are remarkably specific insights, he said carefully. Thomas, you've been discussing this with Rebecca in detail? Thomas struggled to recover. Rebecca sometimes glances at my reports. She must have picked up a few terms. More than terms, Eliza commented quietly. Those figures aren't even in the summary reports. They're buried in the due diligence documentation. All eyes returned to me. The moment had arrived far sooner than I had planned, but perhaps this was better, more authentic, less choreographed than tomorrow's intended revelation. I think, I said, rising from my seat, it's time we had an honest conversation. I walked to the sideboard and retrieved a folder I had prepared for tomorrow. Gerald, you expressed concern earlier about Meridian's anonymous investor group. Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am the principal behind Artemis Investment Collective. I handed him the folder containing verification documents, watching as understanding dawned on his face. You're the majority shareholder, he stated, rather than asked. I am, I confirmed. Have been for the past 3 years. Thomas's face had drained of all color. This is absurd. Rebecca, what game are you playing? No game, Thomas. While you believed I was just a housewife, I was building an investment portfolio that now includes controlling interest in 16 companies across 4 industries. Meridian is simply the most recent acquisition. The dinner party that had begun as Thomas's victory celebration had transformed into something entirely different. As the implications settled over the room, I felt a weight lifting. The burden of pretense I had carried for 15 years, the careful performance of being less than I was. The crystal dessert plates remained untouched as the implications of my revelation rippled through the dining room. Gerald Prescott recovered first, his decades of corporate negotiations evident in his composed demeanor as he reviewed the documents I'd provided. These appear to be in order, he said, closing the folder and handing it to Eliza, who examined the papers with professional scrutiny. Though I'm curious why tomorrow's board meeting was to be your official introduction. Strategic timing, I replied, resuming my seat with a calm I didn't entirely feel. The quarterly results would provide context for the leadership adjustments I intend to propose. Thomas's shock had transformed into something harder, his jaw tightening as he processed the situation. Leadership adjustments, he repeated flatly, meaning my CFO position. Among others, I confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. Your financial acumen isn't in question, Thomas. Your management approach, however, requires significant revision. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the tension. I think I speak for everyone when I say this evening has taken an unexpected turn. He turned to me with newfound respect in his expression. Rebecca, or should I address you differently now? Rebecca is fine, I said. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca, he continued, perhaps you could help us understand how this arrangement came to be. I nodded, recognizing the opportunity to reframe the narrative. The stunned faces around my dining table deserved an explanation, not for my decisions, but for the journey that had led to this moment. 15 years ago, I began. I was senior investment strategist at Blackridge Capital. I specialized in identifying undervalued companies with growth potential, particularly those with strong fundamentals but outdated leadership approaches. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. My previous role had been significantly more senior than the administrative position he had described to friends and colleagues over the years. When Thomas and I married, his career was at a critical juncture. He believed that having a wife with an equally demanding career would reflect poorly on his executive potential. I kept my tone matter-of-fact, stating history rather than grievances. Rather than create conflict, I made a different choice. You left your career, Catherine said quietly, a note of recognition in her voice. I transitioned it, I corrected, gently. With my savings and a small inheritance from my grandmother, I established Artemis Investment Collective. The name was inspired by the goddess of strategy and independence. I took a sip of water, organizing my thoughts. Initially, I managed investments for a small group of clients, primarily women seeking financial independence. Our portfolio performed exceptionally well, allowing us to expand into direct acquisition of undervalued companies. Gerald nodded, thoughtfully, and Meridian became a target. 3 years ago, yes. The company had strong technological assets, but outdated management structures. The potential was evident to anyone looking beyond conventional metrics. Looking beyond conventional metrics, Eliza repeated, a slight smile playing at her lips. Like seeing potential in someone others underestimate. The parallel was impossible to miss. Around the table, understanding dawned at different rates. Valerie and Catherine exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their own experiences as executives' wives. James and Daniel appeared intrigued, rather than uncomfortable, while Marcus seemed almost amused by the turn of events. Thomas alone remained rigid with disbelief and emerging anger. "You've been lying to me for 15 years, he stated, his voice low and controlled. "I've been operating independently," I countered. "Your assumption that managing our household constituted my entire identity was just that, an assumption. Not a lie I told, but a limitation you imposed." "This is manipulation," Thomas insisted, color rising in his face. "You've been using our marriage to gather insider information about Meridian." Eliza shifted forward slightly, her legal mind evidently assessing potential implications. "Rebecca, perhaps we should discuss—" "No need," I interrupted calmly. "I've never traded on non-public information or violated any securities regulations. My investment decisions were based entirely on publicly available data and standard industry analysis. As Thomas frequently reminded me," I added with the slightest edge, "I wasn't included in substantive business discussions." Gerald raised an eyebrow at Thomas, who had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "What exactly do you intend to do with your controlling interest?" James asked, breaking his previous silence. As operations director, his practical mind would naturally focus on immediate implications. "Modernize," I replied simply. "Meridian has remarkable potential that's currently constrained by outdated hierarchies and missing perspectives." I turned to Gerald. "Your technological innovation is excellent, but your organizational structure hasn't evolved since the 1990s. Your executive team lacks diversity of background, thought, and approach, which limits your market understanding and product development." The CEO studied me with new interest. "You've clearly analyzed us thoroughly." "I have," I acknowledged, "just as I've analyzed each company in our portfolio. Meridian isn't an anomaly. It's representative of an industry-wide problem. Technical brilliance hampered by leadership limitations." "And tomorrow's board meeting?" Gerald asked. "We'll proceed as planned, with one adjustment. I'll be attending as myself rather than sending a representative." I glanced around the table. "My intention isn't hostility or disruption, but transformation. Meridian has the potential to be an industry leader in more than just technology." The tension in the room had shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and in some cases, tentative respect. Even Thomas's anger seemed to be evolving into something more nuanced, as the professional implications overtook the personal betrayal. "I think," Gerald said after a thoughtful pause, "we should conclude this evening's social gathering. Tomorrow's board meeting will be the appropriate forum for detailed discussions about Meridian's future direction." Nods around the table indicated agreement. The elegant dinner party I had planned now seemed from another lifetime, a final performance of a role I would never play again. As our guests gathered their belongings and exchanged stilted goodbyes, individual responses to the evening's revelation became clearer. Eliza gave my hand a subtle squeeze of solidarity. Marcus regarded me with newfound professional respect. Catherine and Valerie both embraced me with unexpected warmth, whispering variations of, We should talk soon. Gerald was the last to leave, pausing at the door to address both Thomas and me. I expect to see you both at tomorrow's meeting, 9 o'clock sharp. He held my gaze for a moment. I'm looking forward to hearing your full perspective, Rebecca. When the door closed behind him, the house fell into a silence heavier than any we had experienced in 15 years of marriage. Thomas stood in the foyer, his back to me, shoulders rigid with tension. Why? He asked finally, turning to face me. Why the deception? Why not tell me what you were building? Would you have supported it? I countered. When I mentioned consulting opportunities 3 years ago, you called it a cute hobby that would distract from household management. His expression confirmed the accuracy of my recollection. I made a strategic decision. I continued more gently. Rather than fight for recognition within the constraints of our marriage, I created a parallel path where my abilities could develop without resistance. While making me look like a fool, he said bitterly. That was never my intention, I replied honestly. Your perception of me was your choice, Thomas. I simply chose not to exhaust myself correcting it. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing his profound disorientation. What happens now to us? The question contained layers I wasn't prepared to address that night. Our marriage, his career, my public emergence as Artemis's principal, each represented complex recalibrations that couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. Tonight, we process, I said. Tomorrow we meet with the board. Beyond that. I smiled slightly. For the first time in our marriage, we negotiate as equals. I moved past him toward the staircase, pausing on the first step. One thing is certain, Thomas. The terms of our relationship, personal and professional, will need to be entirely renegotiated. As I climbed the stairs toward the bedroom that had once represented my compromise, but now symbolized merely one aspect of my carefully constructed life, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. The liberation of finally being fully seen, with all the complications that entailed, carried its own particular power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the board meeting, the public revelation, the restructuring of Meridian's leadership, the inevitable questions about my unusual path to corporate control. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of my emergence from the shadows, I allowed myself to experience the profound satisfaction of reclaiming my complete identity. Not just wife, not just investor, not just strategist, but the full integration of all these aspects in a woman who had refused to be limited by others' perceptions. The journey ahead would be complex, but for the first time in 15 years, I would navigate it without pretense or constraint. That liberation, more than any financial success or corporate control, represented the true victory of the evening. The Meridian Technologies executive boardroom occupied the entire northeast corner of the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city skyline. I had seen photographs of this room in corporate materials, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The subtle expressions of power embedded in everything from the 15-foot Brazilian walnut conference table to the carefully curated, modern art on the walls. At precisely 8:45 a.m., I stepped off the private executive elevator, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation. My assistant Claire walked beside me, carrying the presentation materials. We had refined until 2 a.m. After 15 years of operating behind proxies and investment groups, today marked my official emergence as the strategic force behind Artemis Investment Collective. The board members have started arriving, Claire informed me, consulting her tablet. Mr. Prescott has requested a private word before the formal meeting begins. He's in the side conference room. I nodded, mentally adjusting my approach. And Thomas? Arrived 15 minutes ago. He's currently with Ms. Chen in her office. No doubt seeking legal counsel about his options, both professionally and personally. After our confrontation following the dinner party, Thomas had spent the night in the guest room. We had exchanged only the most necessary words this morning, each of us preparing separately for the reckoning that lay ahead. "Thank you, Claire. Let's see what Gerald wants to discuss." The CEO was standing at the window when I entered the conference room, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the city below. He turned at the sound of the door, his expression revealing nothing about his current assessment of the situation. "Rebecca," he greeted me, extending his hand. "Or, perhaps I should address you as Ms. Harrington in this context." I accepted his handshake, noting the subtle recalibration in his manner, the slight increase in formality that acknowledged our altered power dynamic. "Rebecca is still fine, Gerald. My name hasn't changed, just your awareness of my role." He gestured toward the chairs, and we both sat. "I've reviewed your complete file this morning," he said without preamble. "Your acquisition strategy for Meridian was remarkably executed. Incremental investments through 7 different channels, none triggering disclosure requirements until you had established a controlling position. Technically legal in every aspect," I noted. "Indeed, my lawyers confirmed as much in colorful language at 6 a.m. His expression softened slightly. "What I find most interesting, however, isn't the legal structure, but the strategic vision behind it. Your analyst reports on Meridian show deeper understanding of our potential and limitations than most of my executive team has demonstrated in years." I inclined my head, accepting the professional recognition without comment. "Which brings me to my question," Gerald continued. "You clearly have the power to force significant changes at Meridian, including leadership. What exactly are you planning to do with that power?" It was the most direct approach possible, characteristic of Gerald's management style, and exactly what I had prepared for. "Transformation, not destruction," I replied. "Meridian has extraordinary potential that's currently constrained by outdated leadership models and missing perspectives. My goal isn't to dismantle what works, but to evolve what doesn't." "And the board meeting today?" "We'll present a 3-phase transition plan. Phase 1 involves restructuring the executive committee to include diverse perspectives and experiences. Phase 2 addresses operational inefficiencies created by siloed departments. Phase 3 focuses on cultural evolution to support innovation at all levels." Gerald studied me with new intensity. "And my position in this restructured organization?" I appreciated his directness. "Remains as CEO with adjusted responsibilities that better leverage your specific strengths." "Your technical vision is extraordinary, Gerald. Your organizational development skills are not." Rather than taking offense, he laughed, a genuine sound that suggested relief rather than amusement. "Do you know how long I've been waiting for someone to say exactly that? 27 years building this company, and not a single board member has had the courage to state the obvious." This was an unexpected response. I had prepared for resistance, defensiveness, even hostility, not this immediate recognition. "The technical challenges are what drive me," Gerald continued. "The organizational politics drain me, but admitting that felt like failure." "It's not failure to acknowledge your specific genius," I countered. "It's strategic self-awareness." He nodded thoughtfully. "And Thomas? What role do you envision for him?" The question had both professional and personal dimensions, given last night's revelations. "That depends on his response to changed circumstances," I answered carefully. "His financial analysis skills are excellent. His leadership approach and interpersonal awareness need significant development. And if he can't adapt, then he'll receive a generous severance package and strong references for positions better aligned with his specific capabilities." Gerald leaned back in his chair, regarding me with newfound respect. "You've separated the personal from the professional remarkably well in your planning." "Not separated," I clarified. "Integrated with appropriate boundaries." My personal history with Thomas informs my understanding of his professional strengths and limitations, but doesn't determine the organizational decisions. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Claire opened it slightly. "Excuse me, but the board members are all assembled. They're ready to begin whenever you are." "Thank you," I said. "We'll be right there." As Claire closed the door, Gerald stood and straightened his tie. "One last question, Rebecca. Why reveal yourself now? After 15 years of operating in the shadows, why step into the light?" I considered the question carefully. "Because transformation requires visible leadership. Hidden influence can create change, but not cultural evolution. For Meridian to reach its full potential, the vision needs a visible embodiment." He nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "Well, then," he said, gesturing toward the door, "let's introduce the board to Artemis's visible embodiment, shall we?" The main boardroom had filled during our conversation. 14 people sat around the massive table, with Thomas positioned at the far end. His expression remained carefully neutral when I entered, though the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his tension. Eliza sat nearby, her presence a subtle reminder of the legal complexities underlying this transition of power. Gerald took his customary position at the head of the table, but immediately gestured to the space beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, as many of you have already heard through various channels, we have a significant development to address before our quarterly review. I'd like to introduce Rebecca Harrington, principal of Artemis Investment Collective and Meridian's majority shareholder." Murmurs rippled through the room as I took my place beside Gerald. The assembled board members, predominantly men in their 50s and 60s, with 3 women who had been appointed within the last 5 years, regarded me with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to outright hostility. "Thank you, Gerald," I began, my voice clear and confident. "I recognize that my presence comes as a surprise to most of you. For the past 3 years, Artemis Investment Collective has been strategically acquiring Meridian shares through various channels, culminating in our current controlling interest of 53%. I paused, allowing this information to settle. Several board members exchanged glances, while others studied the documents Claire was distributing. These materials outline our analysis of Meridian's current position, including both strengths and limitations. As you review them, you'll notice that our assessment differs significantly from the narratives presented in previous board meetings. Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the documents, his expression unreadable. "Meridian possesses extraordinary technological capabilities and market potential," I continued. "However, this potential is currently constrained by 3 critical limitations: outdated leadership structures, insufficient diversity of perspective, and cultural stagnation that inhibits innovation." The oldest board member, Harold Winters, cleared his throat aggressively. "With all due respect, Ms. Harrington, Meridian has consistently outperformed market expectations under our current leadership. Our stock value has increased 26% over the past 2 years alone. 26% represents significant underperformance given market conditions and your technological assets," I replied calmly. "Your closest competitors have averaged 38% growth during the same period with inferior products. The gap represents the cost of your organizational limitations." Before Harold could respond, I continued. Page 12 provides comparative analysis of innovation metrics across the sector. Meridian generates more patents, but successfully commercializes fewer innovations than any competitor. Page 24 shows employee engagement metrics trending downward for 6 consecutive quarters, with particular declines among women and minorities in technical roles. The board members turned to the referenced pages, their expressions shifting as they absorbed data that contradicted their established narratives about Meridian's performance. "These aren't opinions or subjective assessments," I emphasized. "These are quantifiable indicators of systemic issues that limit Meridian's potential. issues that this board has consistently overlooked or rationalized. Gerald nodded slightly, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the other members. His tacit support altered the dynamic, creating space for consideration rather than defensive rejection. The proposal before you today, I continued, outlines a 3-phase transformation strategy designed to address these limitations while preserving and enhancing Meridian's core strengths. I invite your genuine engagement with this proposal, not as a threat to what exists, but as a pathway to what's possible. For the next 40 minutes, I presented the transformation strategy in detail, addressing questions as they arose. The initial hostility gradually evolved into tentative engagement as board members recognized the depth of analysis underlying the proposal. Thomas remained silent throughout, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. Only when I addressed the executive restructuring did he finally speak. This proposal effectively eliminates my position as CFO, he stated flatly. Is that coincidental timing given our personal relationship, or the actual purpose of this entire acquisition strategy? The question hung in the air, its dual implications impossible to miss. He was questioning both my professional judgment and my personal motives, suggesting that Artemis's acquisition of Meridian might be nothing more than elaborate revenge for his dismissive treatment. I met his gaze directly. The restructuring eliminates the traditional CFO role and creates 2 new positions: Chief Financial Strategist and Chief Investment Officer. This reflects best practices for companies at Meridian's current scale. Your skills make you an excellent candidate for the financial strategist role, should you choose to apply. Under your direct supervision, he noted, under a collaborative leadership structure that includes appropriate checks and balances, I corrected, no one person, including me, will have unilateral authority in the proposed model. Thomas sat back, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. For the first time since last night's revelation, I glimpsed something beyond his wounded ego, perhaps the beginning of genuine professional reassessment. As the meeting continued, the transformation strategy gained tentative support from most board members. Even Harold's objections became more nuanced, focusing on implementation timelines rather than rejecting the changes outright. When the formal presentation concluded, Gerald called for a preliminary vote on proceeding with Phase 1 of the transformation. The result, 12 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 against, represented stronger initial support than I had anticipated. Given this clear direction, Gerald announced, we'll reconvene tomorrow to begin implementation planning. In the meantime, I suggest everyone review the materials thoroughly and come prepared with specific questions about your roles in the transformation process. As the meeting adjourned, board members approached me individually, introducing themselves with newfound respect or curiosity. The dynamics had shifted dramatically in just 2 hours, from viewing me as an interloper to recognizing me as a strategic force with valuable perspective. Thomas waited until the room had emptied before approaching. Impressive presentation, he said, his tone neutral, though I'm still processing the methods behind it. Understandable, I acknowledged. It's a significant adjustment, professionally and personally. He nodded, his expression suggesting internal conflict beyond what he was prepared to articulate. I need time to consider my options regarding the new structure, and regarding us. Take the time you need, I replied. Both decisions deserve careful consideration. As he turned to leave, I added, Thomas, whatever you decide professionally, I hope you understand that this was never about you. It was about creating space for me to fully exist. As an investor, a strategist, and a leader in my own right. He paused, something shifting in his expression. I'm beginning to understand that, he said quietly, though I wish I had realized it 15 years ago. After he left, I remained in the boardroom alone, looking out at the city skyline. The morning had unfolded largely as planned, Yet the reality felt different from what I had anticipated. Not just the professional victory of seeing my transformation strategy accepted, but the personal liberation of finally integrating my complete identity after years of compartmentalization. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many, in the coming weeks and months, they would be navigated from a position of wholeness rather than fragmentation. That integration represented the true success of the day, beyond any corporate restructuring or strategic initiative. The transformation I had designed for Meridian would proceed, but the transformation that mattered most had already occurred. The woman who had been divided was now whole, ready to lead from authentic integration rather than strategic separation. 3 weeks after the transformative board meeting, I stood at the podium in Meridian's largest conference center, facing an audience of 500 employees gathered for the company-wide town hall. The room hummed with anticipation, a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and cautious optimism that reflected the cascading changes already reshaping the organization. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and clear. "For those who haven't yet met me in your departmental sessions, I'm Rebecca Harrington, chairperson of Meridian's newly formed Executive Leadership Council." The formal introduction felt surreal, after years of operating behind carefully constructed barriers of anonymity. Yet the discomfort of visibility was counterbalanced by the profound satisfaction of finally standing fully in my truth, professionally, personally, and strategically, aligned for the first time in 15 years. "Today marks the completion of Phase 1 in our transformation journey," I continued. "Over the past 3 weeks, we've restructured our leadership model, initiated cross-functional innovation teams, and begun the cultural assessment that will guide our ongoing evolution. I want to acknowledge that change of this magnitude creates uncertainty, and your patience during this transition reflects the professionalism that makes Meridian exceptional." From my position on the stage, I could see the diversity of reactions across the audience, the younger employees leaning forward with evident enthusiasm, middle managers watching with measured assessment, and a few senior executives whose discomfort with the new direction remained visible despite their public compliance. "The transformation we're undertaking isn't merely structural," I explained. "It's foundational, a fundamental recalibration of how we operate, innovate, and create value together. The purpose isn't disruption for its own sake, but unlocking the extraordinary potential that exists when diverse perspectives converge around shared objectives." As I spoke, my gaze briefly found Thomas in the third row, seated among his financial team. His expression was thoughtful rather than antagonistic, a significant evolution from the shock and anger that had characterized our initial confrontation. Though our personal relationship remained in careful renegotiation, his professional adaptation had surprised even me. After 2 days of evident struggle following the board meeting, he had requested a formal interview for the financial strategist position, engaging with the selection committee with unprecedented humility and self-awareness. "Many of you have asked about the story behind Artemis Investment Collective and my journey to Meridian," I continued, addressing the curiosity that had fueled corridor conversations since my emergence. While the business media has created various narratives, from corporate espionage to elaborate revenge plots, the truth is both simpler and more complex. I paused, considering how much of my personal journey belonged in this professional context. The decision to share more vulnerable aspects of my story hadn't come easily, but the leadership coaches I'd engaged with had convinced me that authentic narrative created more meaningful connection than polished corporate messaging. 15 years ago, I faced a choice that many of you might recognize: between conforming to external expectations or creating an alternative path that honored my capabilities and aspirations. Rather than limiting my options to the visible choices presented, I designed a third path, building Artemis Investment Collective from the foundation of my experience as an investment strategist specialized in organizational transformation. The room had grown quieter, attention intensifying as employees recognized this wasn't a standard corporate presentation, but something more personal and potentially relevant to their own experiences. Artemis began with a clear investment philosophy, identifying companies with exceptional technical assets, but limited organizational vision. Companies where innovation was constrained not by capability, but by culture. Companies precisely like Meridian Technologies. I gestured to the large screen behind me, where a series of charts illustrated Meridian's technical brilliance alongside its organizational limitations. These patterns revealed a company with extraordinary potential held back by outdated leadership, models, and insufficient diversity of perspective. The acquisition wasn't motivated by financial metrics alone, but by the opportunity to demonstrate how different leadership approaches could unlock exponential, rather than incremental growth. From the middle section of the audience, Elena Vega, a brilliant systems architect recently promoted to the Innovation Council, raised her hand. When I nodded acknowledgement, she asked the question that undoubtedly occupied many minds. What made you decide to reveal yourself now, after operating anonymously for so long? The directness of the question deserved equal candor in response. Two realizations converged, I explained. First, that Meridian's transformation required visible leadership, a clear embodiment of the values and approaches we're implementing. Second, and perhaps more personally significant, I recognized that my own effectiveness was being limited by the same fractured identity I was identifying in organizations. I stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the audience. For years, I operated as if different aspects of my identity, strategic investor, organizational designer, and yes, spouse of a Meridian executive, needed to remain carefully separated. That separation seemed necessary for practical reasons, but it created the same siloing effect we're now addressing in Meridian's structure. A ripple of recognition moved through the room, particularly among women in middle management positions who had navigated similar compartmentalization in their own careers. The integration of those supposedly separate identities wasn't just a personal decision, it was a strategic one, I continued. Authentic leadership requires wholeness. We cannot expect an organization to evolve beyond its current limitations if its leaders remain trapped in fragmented self-concepts or artificial separations between personal values and professional actions. From the side of the stage, I noticed Gerald nodding slightly, an acknowledgement of the leadership philosophy we had discussed extensively during our realigned working relationship. After initial wariness, he had embraced the collaborative leadership model with unexpected enthusiasm, finding liberation in focusing on technological vision while others managed the organizational aspects he had always found draining. This brings me to the most important message I want to share today, I said, returning to the podium. Transformation, whether personal or organizational, requires both courage and strategy. The courage to acknowledge limitations in current patterns, and the strategy to create pathways toward more authentic and effective alternatives. I clicked to the next slide, revealing Meridian's new organizational structure, not the traditional hierarchy that had governed operations for decades, but an interconnected network of expertise councils and cross-functional teams designed to maximize collaboration while maintaining clear accountability. This structure represents more than boxes on an organizational chart, I explained. It embodies a fundamental shift in how we understand leadership itself, not as positional authority concentrated in a few individuals, but as distributed influence, based on expertise, perspective, and collaborative capacity. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined the practical implications of this new model, addressing questions about reporting relationships, decision-making processes, and performance evaluation. The discussion was substantive and engaged, reflecting the growing recognition that this transformation offered genuine opportunity rather than merely disruptive change. As the town hall concluded, I offered a final thought. The journey we're undertaking together isn't simply about making Meridian more profitable or competitive. though those outcomes will certainly follow. It's about creating an organization where extraordinary talent can express itself fully, where artificial barriers between who we are and what we do are removed, allowing genuine innovation to flourish. That integration of purpose, potential, and practice is what will distinguish Meridian in the marketplace and in your professional lives. The applause that followed wasn't the obligatory acknowledgement of corporate messaging, but something more authentic, a collective recognition of possibility that transcended standard organizational change initiatives. As employees began filing out, many approached the stage with questions or comments that revealed personal connection to the transformation philosophy. Elena Vega waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Your story about creating a third path resonated deeply," she said. "I've been stuck in exactly that false dichotomy, between conforming to existing structures or leaving to start something new, the possibility of transformation from within. That's a perspective I hadn't considered viable." Her comment encapsulated precisely what I had hoped to convey. Not just a corporate restructuring, but a fundamental reconsideration of how change happens, both personally and organizationally. After addressing several more questions, I gathered my materials and headed toward the executive offices for my next meeting. In the corridor, Thomas was waiting, his expression suggesting he had deliberately positioned himself to create this encounter. "That was," he began, then paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Remarkable isn't strong enough. Transformative feels closer." "Thank you," I replied, noting the genuine appreciation in his tone rather than the defensive posturing that had characterized our earlier interactions. "Your description of fragmented identity," he continued more carefully, "that resonated beyond the organizational context. I've been reflecting on how much energy I've invested in maintaining artificial separations in my own life, between professional and personal values, between capability and compassion." This level of self-reflection represented significant evolution from the man who had dismissively called me just a housewife 3 weeks earlier. "Integration requires conscious effort," I acknowledged, "especially after years of practiced compartmentalization." He nodded thoughtfully. "The selection committee is meeting about the financial strategist position this afternoon. Whatever they decide, I wanted you to know that this process has catalyzed important recalibration for me, professionally and personally." "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. Thomas hesitated, then added, "I've moved my things to a short-term corporate apartment. Not as a statement about our marriage, but to create space for genuine reassessment without the complications of daily proximity. I hope that makes sense." The decision aligned with the careful boundaries we had established in the aftermath of my revelation, neither precipitously ending the relationship nor pretending we could immediately resume normal interaction after such fundamental disruption. "It does," I assured him. "Real transformation requires space for honest reflection." As Thomas continued toward the finance department and I proceeded to my next meeting, I reflected on the parallel evolution occurring in both Meridian's organizational structure and my personal life. The artificial separations being dissolved, the new configurations emerging, the fundamental recalibration of what was possible when authentic integration replaced strategic fragmentation. The path ahead remained complex, with organizational resistance still to be navigated and personal relationships still to be redefined. Yet the foundation had been established, not just for Meridian's transformation, but for my own continuing evolution from divided strategist to integrated leader. The woman who had operated in shadows for 15 years was now standing fully in the light, bringing all aspects of her capability and vision into alignment. That integration represented the true meaning of the phrase I had chosen as Artemis Investment Collective's founding philosophy, now inscribed on the wall of Meridian's newly designed Innovation Center. Transformation begins when we refuse to accept the limitations of existing narratives and instead create paths that honor our complete potential. 2 months into Meridian's transformation, I stood at the windows of my newly established office, watching the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the city. The space reflected my integrated approach to leadership, neither the intimidating executive suite that had been Gerald's domain, nor the overly modest accommodation that might have undermined my authority. Instead, the design balanced accessibility with appropriate boundaries, featuring glass walls that could become opaque for confidential conversations, and a conference area designed for collaborative problem-solving rather than hierarchical presentations. A gentle knock at the open door interrupted my reflections. Claire entered with a tablet displaying my afternoon schedule. The Innovation Council has submitted their final recommendations for the product development restructuring, she reported. And the profile in Business Vanguard just went live online. Thank you, I replied, accepting the tablet and scanning the publication notification. The article represented my first formal media interview since emerging as Artemis's principal, a strategic decision to address the speculation that had surrounded my unusual path to corporate leadership. Also, Claire added with a slight smile, the Executive Leadership Council's vote on Thomas's appointment was unanimous. They're extending the official offer for the financial strategist position this afternoon. I nodded, appreciating both the professional significance of this development and its personal implications. Thomas's journey over the past 2 months had surprised nearly everyone, especially those who had expected him to reject Meridian's new direction outright. Instead, he had engaged in a remarkable process of professional reinvention, acknowledging limitations in his previous leadership approach, actively seeking feedback from colleagues he had previously dismissed, and developing a financial strategy framework that aligned with Meridian's transformation philosophy. That's excellent news, I said. His proposal for integrating financial metrics with innovation outcomes was genuinely impressive. Claire's expression suggested she recognized the complexity beneath my measured response. In the 2 months since Thomas had moved to the corporate apartment, our personal relationship had remained in careful renegotiation, neither definitively ended nor automatically restored. We had established a structured approach to this process, working with a relationship counselor to examine patterns that had defined our 15-year marriage and assess whether a healthier configuration might be possible. Your call with the Singapore investment team is in 15 minutes, Claire reminded me, tactfully shifting back to professional matters. And Elena Vega requested a brief conversation before tomorrow's product council meeting. Please tell Elena I can see her at 8:30 tomorrow morning, I replied, and I'll take the Singapore call in the conference room. I need the larger display for their presentation. After Claire departed, I returned my attention to the business Vanguard article now displayed on my tablet. The headline captured the media's continuing fascination with my unorthodox journey. The Strategist in the Shadows, How Rebecca Harrington Built a Corporate Empire While Being Underestimated. The profile was more substantive than most business media coverage, exploring the investment philosophy behind Artemis's acquisitions and the transformation approach I was implementing at Meridian. Still, the narrative framing emphasized the elements of secrecy and revelation that made my story mediagenic, the hidden genius finally emerging from obscurity to claim rightful recognition. The characterization wasn't entirely inaccurate, but missed the deeper dimensions of my journey. The media narrative positioned my 15 years of operating behind investment groups and proxies as a strategic response to gender bias in corporate finance, a woman forced to hide her identity to be taken seriously. While that external barrier had certainly existed, the complete truth included internal factors as well, my own complicated relationship with visibility, power, and integrated identity. A notification appeared on my screen, the quarterly performance metrics from Meridian's engineering division. I set aside reflections on media narratives to focus on these more tangible indicators of our transformation progress. The results were encouraging. Innovation pipeline velocity had increased 23% since implementing the cross-functional development teams. and employee engagement scores showed significant improvement across all demographics. Most telling was the psychological safety metric, a measurement of employees' willingness to express divergent perspectives without fear of negative consequences. This indicator had shown the most dramatic improvement, increasing 41% in engineering teams and 37% company-wide. The cultural shift was taking hold faster than even our most optimistic projections had suggested. I was still reviewing these metrics when Gerald appeared at my door, his expression conveying unusual excitement. As our working relationship had evolved, I had come to appreciate the genuine brilliance behind his sometimes abrupt manner, the visionary technologist who had founded Meridian, but struggled with the human dimensions of organizational leadership. "The Westfield prototype is working," he announced without preamble, referring to the innovative security architecture that represented Meridian's most ambitious technical initiative. The team just completed the final integration test. "It's revolutionary, Rebecca. Exactly what we envisioned but couldn't execute under the previous structure." The significance of this breakthrough extended beyond the specific technology. The Westfield architecture had stalled repeatedly under Meridian's old siloed development approach, with teams from different divisions unable to resolve integration challenges across their specialized domains. The cross-functional methodology we had implemented was designed precisely to address such complex innovation challenges. "That's extraordinary progress," I acknowledged, "especially given the previous timeline projections." Gerald nodded, leaning against the door frame. "The technical obstacles haven't changed. What's different is how teams are approaching them, collaboratively rather than competitively. People are sharing insights across traditional boundaries, building on each other's work instead of protecting intellectual territory." This validation of our transformation approach from the company's founding technologist carried particular weight. Gerald had initially embraced the restructuring with professional discipline rather than personal conviction, accepting the evidence-based case for change while harboring private doubts about soft elements like cultural dynamics and collaborative methodologies. "The interdisciplinary teams are producing exactly the results we hypothesized," I noted. "Complexity requires diverse perspectives integrated through structured collaboration." "I was skeptical," Gerald admitted candidly. "I've seen too many organizational change initiatives that generated impressive PowerPoints, but negligible results. This is different. Tangible improvements in both technical outcomes and team dynamics." His acknowledgement represented significant evolution in our working relationship, from the wary CEO accepting a major shareholder's authority to a genuine thought partner engaged in collaborative leadership. "Speaking of results," Gerald continued, "have you seen the analyst updates? 3 major firms have upgraded their Meridian ratings in the past week. The market is starting to recognize what's happening here." I nodded, having reviewed these reports earlier. The external validation is encouraging, though ultimately secondary to the internal transformation metrics. "Always the long-term strategist," Gerald observed with a slight smile. "While I appreciate the immediate confirmation bias of positive market response, complementary perspectives," I reminded him. "That's the foundation of our leadership model." After Gerald departed to join the Westfield team's celebration, I prepared for my call with the Singapore investors. As I organized my notes, I reflected on the accelerating momentum of Meridian's transformation, not just in technical innovation or market perception, but in the fundamental way people throughout the organization were engaging with their work and each other. The quarterly town hall the previous week had revealed this shift most visibly, with employees from all levels asking substantive questions, offering genuine input, and demonstrating ownership of the transformation process. The contrast with the wariness that had characterized the initial announcement was striking, evidence that the changes weren't merely structural, but genuinely cultural. The Singapore call proceeded smoothly, focusing on potential expansion of our investment relationship to include collaborative ventures in the Asian market. The investment team had been early supporters of Artemis's approach, recognizing the value proposition behind our organizational transformation strategy before most Western investors fully appreciated its implications. As the call concluded, my phone signaled a personal message from Thomas, not through our usual counseling-mediated communication channel, but directly. The text was simple. Just received the official offer. Would appreciate the opportunity to discuss in person. Dinner, perhaps? The request represented a potential shift in our carefully structured separation, suggesting a desire for more direct engagement outside the formal counseling process. After 2 months of facilitated conversations exploring patterns and possibilities, this movement toward less mediated interaction felt significant. I considered my response carefully. The counselor had emphasized the importance of clear boundaries during this assessment period, cautioning against premature resumption of familiar patterns before establishing whether genuine transformation was possible. Yet the progress Thomas had demonstrated professionally suggested parallel evolution in his personal awareness, the capacity for self-reflection and authentic change that would be necessary for any meaningful reconfiguration of our relationship. "Congratulations on the appointment," I replied. "Dinner would be fine. The new bistro on Lakeside Drive, perhaps? 7:30 tomorrow evening?" His response came quickly. "Perfect. Looking forward to it." The exchange complete, I returned to my review of the Innovation Council recommendations, conscious of the parallel processes unfolding simultaneously: Meridian's organizational transformation, my own continuing integration of previously compartmentalized identities, and the potential reconfiguration of my relationship with Thomas. The common element linking these seemingly separate domains was the same fundamental principle. Authentic transformation requires not just structural changes, but deeper evolution in how we understand ourselves and engage with others. Whether in corporate leadership, personal development, or intimate relationships, sustainable change emerges from integration rather than fragmentation, from honest assessment rather than strategic avoidance. As I completed my review of the innovation proposals and prepared for my next meeting, Elena Vega appeared at my door. Though our scheduled conversation wasn't until the following morning, her expressions suggested something important had developed. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she began. "But I wanted to share something that couldn't wait until tomorrow. The cross-functional team just submitted their solution for the enterprise security challenge, the one that's been stalled in development for nearly 18 months. The significance of this breakthrough was immediately apparent. The enterprise security platform represented Meridian's most complex development initiative, involving integration across 7 specialized domains that had previously operated as independent silos. "That's remarkable progress," I acknowledged, "especially given the technical complexity involved." "The solution itself is impressive," Elena continued, "but what I wanted to share was the process that produced it. The breakthrough came from Maria Chen in user experience design, someone who would never have been included in security architecture discussions under the previous structure. This exemplified precisely the transformation philosophy we had been implementing, that innovation at complex intersections requires diverse perspectives traditionally excluded from specialized domains. Maria identified a pattern in user behavior that completely reframed the security approach, Elena explained, her enthusiasm evident. But here's what matters most. Under the old structure, she wouldn't have had access to the security protocols, and the specialized teams wouldn't have valued input from someone outside their domain expertise. The real-world validation of our transformation approach was accumulating faster than even our optimistic projections had suggested, not just in improved metrics or market perception, but in tangible innovation outcomes that had previously seemed unattainable. "This is exactly the integration effect we've been working toward," I noted. "Complex challenges require perspectives from multiple domains, connected through structured collaboration rather than hierarchical handoffs." Elena nodded emphatically. "The team is calling it integrated innovation. the recognition that breakthroughs happen at the intersections between specialized knowledge domains, not within their isolated boundaries. As Elena continued describing the technical specifics of the solution, I recognized the deeper significance of this development. Beyond the particular security architecture, it represented vindication of the transformation philosophy that had guided my approach at Artemis and now at Meridian, that organizational effectiveness emerges from integration rather than separation, from collaborative strength rather than competitive positioning. The same principle that was transforming Meridian's innovation capacity had guided my own journey from compartmentalized strategist to integrated leader. The parallel wasn't coincidental, but essential. Authentic organizational transformation requires leaders who embody the integration they seek to create in their organizations. When Elena departed, I returned to the window, observing the city transitioning from late afternoon to early evening. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, a period of illuminated transition between established patterns and emerging possibilities. In that liminal space, both organizationally and personally, lay the greatest potential for authentic transformation. The Lakeside Bistro occupied a prime corner location with expansive windows overlooking the water. I arrived precisely at 7:25, allowing a moment to settle my thoughts before Thomas's arrival. The restaurant had opened just 3 weeks earlier, making it neutral territory, a place without associations to our shared history or established patterns. I had chosen my outfit with deliberate intention, a deep blue dress that projected confidence without defensiveness, professional without being impersonal. The nuances of presentation remained relevant, not for Thomas's approval, but as an external reflection of my internal integration. No longer compartmentalizing between professional strategist and personal identity, I had developed a consistent embodiment that honored all aspects of my being. Thomas arrived at 7:28, characteristic punctuality reflecting his fundamental reliability. Despite the complexities of our current situation, he had also chosen his attire thoughtfully, business casual rather than the formal suits that had been his uniform throughout our marriage. The subtle change suggested openness to new patterns rather than rigid adherence to established identity. "You look well," he said after the maitre d' had seated us at a corner table with partial privacy. The observation carried no undertone of evaluation or agenda, simply authentic acknowledgement. "Thank you," I replied. "So do you." It was true beyond polite reciprocation. The past 2 months had transformed him physically as well as professionally. The perpetual tension he had carried in his shoulders noticeably reduced, his expression more present rather than constantly anticipating the next strategic move. After ordering drinks, sparkling water for me, a glass of Merlot for him, we navigated initial conversational territory carefully. The weather, the restaurant's impressive design, brief updates on family members. These exchanges served their purpose, establishing comfortable interaction without immediately diving into more consequential domains. "Congratulations again on the appointment," I said as our drinks arrived. "Your proposal for integrating financial metrics with innovation outcomes was genuinely impressive." "Thank you," he replied, his expression reflecting both pride and something more complex. Though I recognize the irony in being recognized for insights about integration, given my history of compartmentalization. The self-awareness in this observation represented significant evolution from the man who had dismissed me as just a housewife 3 months earlier. Our counseling sessions had explored this pattern extensively, how Thomas had systematically separated domains in both professional and personal contexts, creating artificial boundaries that ultimately limited his effectiveness in both spheres. "Integration is a learnable skill," I noted, "not an innate trait. A skill you mastered while I remained oblivious to its importance," he acknowledged. "That's become increasingly clear as I've engaged with Meridian's transformation. Your investment strategy at Artemis, it was never just about financial returns. Was it? It was about demonstrating a fundamentally different way of understanding organizational effectiveness. The observation surprised me with its accuracy. Most observers, including business journalists covering my emergence as Artemis's principal, had characterized my investment approach primarily in financial terms, identifying undervalued assets, leveraging market inefficiencies, capitalizing on growth potential. Thomas had recognized the deeper philosophy underlying these tactical elements. The financial strategy served a larger purpose, I confirmed, demonstrating that integration rather than fragmentation produces superior outcomes in organizations, leadership, and ultimately innovation. Our conversation paused as the server arrived with our appetizers. When we resumed, Thomas shifted to more personal territory with characteristic directness. "I've been reflecting extensively on patterns in our marriage," he said, "particularly my systematic undervaluation of your capabilities and perspective. The counseling has helped me recognize how deeply those patterns were embedded in my understanding of relationship dynamics." This level of reflection represented genuine progress beyond the initial shock and defensive positioning that had characterized his response to my revelation. The question was whether this newfound awareness could translate into sustained behavioral change, the central uncertainty. In any relationship attempting transformation after established patterns have been disrupted. "What's become clear," he continued, "is that I wasn't seeing you, not fully. I was seeing a limited version filtered through my own biases and expectations. The revelation about Artemis didn't create our problems. It simply exposed patterns that had been operating for years." The assessment aligned with insights from our counseling process, though hearing Thomas articulate this understanding directly rather than through facilitated discussion carried different weight. The compartmentalization wasn't just professional, I observed. It shaped our personal dynamics as well, the implicit boundary between your important work and my supportive role. Thomas nodded, no defensiveness in his expression. "A boundary I established and maintained because it served my ego, not because it reflected reality. I constructed a narrative where my corporate advancement represented our shared primary achievement, rather than recognizing your independent objectives and capabilities." As our main courses arrived, the conversation continued in this reflective vein. Thomas shared insights from his individual therapy, including recognition of how his father's rigid traditionalism had shaped his understanding of gender roles and professional identity. I described my parallel exploration of why I had accepted such comprehensive compartmentalization for so long, the complex interplay between external constraints and internal patterns established long before our marriage. "The question we've been circling," Thomas said as we finished our meals, "is whether awareness of these patterns creates possibility for genuine transformation in our relationship, whether what we've built remains viable with these new understandings." It was the central uncertainty we had been exploring through counseling, whether recognition of problematic patterns could translate into sustainable new configurations, or whether the relationship had been irreparably defined by its foundational dynamics. "That's not a question with a simple answer," I replied. "It depends on multiple factors, not just awareness, but sustained commitment to different patterns, even when challenging. The capacity for consistent integration rather than reflexive compartmentalization. And whether trust can be rebuilt after such fundamental disruption," Thomas added. "Not just trust in each other's intentions, but in our capacity to maintain healthier patterns over time." This recognition of trust's complexity demonstrated his evolving understanding. Earlier in our counseling process, he had framed trust primarily in terms of honesty about specific facts, rather than reliability of patterns, and consistency between stated values and lived behaviors. The past 2 months have provided valuable assessment data, I observed. Your engagement with Meridian's transformation demonstrates capacity for adaptation that wasn't evident before. The question is whether that capacity extends to personal as well as professional domains. Thomas considered this thoughtfully. I believe it does, though I recognize that belief requires validation through consistent behavior rather than temporary adjustment. What I'm discovering through this process is that integrated approaches produce better outcomes in all domains, not just organizational effectiveness, but personal well-being and relationship quality. His insight reflected genuine evolution beyond strategic compliance with new expectations. He wasn't simply adapting to changed power dynamics, but recognizing the inherent value of integration as an operating principle. I don't have definitive answers yet, he continued after a pause, about whether we should attempt to rebuild our marriage or transition to a different relationship configuration. What I do know is that regardless of that outcome, the patterns we established weren't serving either of us fully. You created an alternative path that honored your capabilities. I conformed to expectations that limited my development in ways I'm only beginning to recognize. This framing, acknowledging that our established patterns had constrained his growth as well as mine, represented significant maturation in his understanding. Earlier discussions had positioned the transformation primarily as addressing my needs rather than recognizing how compartmentalization had limited both our potentials. As we declined dessert and requested the check, Thomas asked a question that surprised me with its perceptiveness. What has been most meaningful for you in Meridian's transformation so far, beyond the professional validation or financial performance? The question demonstrated genuine interest in my perspective rather than projection of his assumptions, another indicator of evolving patterns in our interaction. The integration effect, I replied after consideration. Watching people discover capacities that remained untapped in the previous structure. Elena Vega's cross-functional team developing the security solution that had stalled for 18 months. The product designers collaborating directly with technical architects rather than through hierarchical handoffs. These aren't just efficiency improvements, they're expansions of human potential. Thomas nodded, genuine understanding in his expression. I've experienced that effect personally. The collaborative leadership model has revealed capabilities I didn't recognize in myself, particularly around synthesizing diverse perspectives rather than imposing predetermined solutions. It's been liberating in ways I wouldn't have anticipated. As we walked from the restaurant toward the waterfront promenade, our conversation shifted to specific experiences from the past 2 months, professional developments, insights, from our separate therapy processes, observations about patterns we were each working to transform. The exchange felt qualitatively different from our interactions before the revelation. More mutually curious, less positionally defended, genuinely interested in each other's evolving understanding. Near the central fountain, Thomas paused, his expression reflecting internal deliberation before speaking. I've been considering requesting a transition from our structured counseling sessions to more direct exploration, similar to this evening's conversation. Not abandoning professional support, but shifting toward more authentic engagement rather than exclusively facilitated interaction. The suggestion aligned with my own assessment of our progress, that while the counseling structure had been essential for initial pattern recognition and boundary establishment, continued growth might require more natural interaction within those developing awareness. That seems like a reasonable evolution, I agreed, though maintaining some facilitated sessions would provide valuable assessment of whether new patterns are sustaining or reverting under less structured conditions. Thomas smiled slightly, appreciation for the strategic framing rather than purely emotional response. Always the systems thinker, he observed without criticism. A balanced approach makes sense. Perhaps alternating between facilitated and direct interaction for the next phase. We continued walking along the promenade, the conversation flowing with surprising ease between professional developments and personal reflections. Near the marina, Thomas shared an insight from his individual therapy that particularly resonated. My therapist suggested that my rigid compartmentalization reflected fundamental insecurity, fear that integration would reveal inadequacies I couldn't acknowledge. Maintaining separate domains allowed me to curate different versions of myself adapted to each context, rather than developing an authentic core identity capable of appropriate adaptation without fragmentation. The observation paralleled concepts we had explored in organizational transformation. How siloed departments often reflected similar defensive patterns, protecting specialized expertise from exposure to broader contexts that might reveal limitations or require uncomfortable collaboration. That pattern is remarkably consistent across domains, I noted. Individual psychology, relationship dynamics, organizational structures, all reflecting the same fundamental tension between integration and fragmentation. Which explains why your transformation approach is proving so effective, Thomas observed. It addresses the underlying pattern rather than just its surface manifestations. As we completed our circuit of the promenade and approached the parking area, the conversation naturally arrived at practical next steps. We agreed to discuss a modified counseling schedule with our therapist, balancing facilitated sessions with more direct interaction similar to this evening's conversation. "Thank you for this," Thomas said as we reached my car. "Not just dinner, but the opportunity for genuine exchange beyond our structured sessions. It's been clarifying." "It has," I agreed. "Though I recognize we're still early in this assessment process." Sustainable transformation requires consistent integration of awareness into behavior, not just intellectual recognition of patterns. He nodded, acknowledging the measured perspective without defensiveness. "A journey rather than a destination," he observed, "in both organizational and personal contexts." As I drove home, I reflected on the evening's significance, not as definitive resolution, but as meaningful indicator of potential. The conversation had demonstrated Thomas's capacity for growth beyond established patterns, for genuine engagement rather than strategic positioning. Whether this evolution would ultimately support rebuilding our marriage remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the transformation principles proving so effective at Meridian applied equally to personal relationships. That integration, rather than compartmentalization, created possibility for more authentic and effective connection in all domains. The parallel journeys of organizational and personal transformation continued unfolding, each informing the other through consistent application of the same fundamental principle. That authentic effectiveness emerges from integration rather than fragmentation, from wholeness rather than artificial separation between aspects of our being. Whatever specific configuration emerged for my relationship with Thomas, this understanding represented valuable growth. The recognition that transformation follows consistent patterns across domains, creating possibility wherever we have courage to examine established limitations and embrace more integrated alternatives. 6 months into Meridian's transformation journey, the quarterly leadership summit gathered in the company's newly redesigned Innovation Center. The space embodied our integrated approach, open collaborative areas balanced with focused work, zones, technology enabling seamless connection between in-person and remote participants, and design elements that subtly reinforced our transformation philosophy. As 45 leaders from across the organization settled into the main collaboration arena, I observed the diversity now represented in Meridian's leadership, not just demographic variety, though that had increased significantly, but diversity of thinking styles, professional backgrounds, and organizational perspectives. Where the previous leadership structure had drawn primarily from technical specializations, with similar educational and career trajectories, the integrated model had created pathways for exceptional talent from throughout the organization. "Welcome to our second quarterly summit," I began, moving to the center of the arena. "Today represents an important milestone in our transformation journey, the formal transition from Phase 1 to Phase 2, from establishing foundational structures to accelerating innovation outcomes." The energy in the room felt markedly different from our first summit 3 months earlier. Where that gathering had combined cautious optimism with lingering skepticism, Today's assembly carried palpable confidence based on tangible results rather than theoretical possibilities. The metrics tell a compelling story, I continued, gesturing toward the visualization wall where performance data updated in real time. Innovation velocity has increased 43%. Time to market has decreased by 29%. Customer adoption of new features is tracking 61%, above previous release patterns. These results had begun shifting external perceptions as well. Meridian's stock had risen 34% since transformation began. Extraordinary performance in a sector averaging 11% growth during the same period. Analyst ratings had shifted from cautious to enthusiastic, with 3 major firms publishing detailed case studies of our transformation approach. While these performance indicators are encouraging, I emphasized, the cultural metrics reveal something more fundamental. Psychological safety scores have increased across all departments and demographic groups. Cross-functional collaboration has become normative rather than exceptional. Employee engagement measures show the highest sustained levels in Meridian's history. From my position in the center, I could observe individual responses to this assessment. The quiet satisfaction among early champions who had embraced transformation from the beginning. The surprised acknowledgement from initial skeptics who had expected more limited outcomes. The thoughtful analysis from newer leaders trying to understand the underlying patterns that had produced these results. Today's summit focuses on accelerating this momentum, I explained. Phase 2 elevates our transformation from structural foundations to expansive innovation, applying our integrated approach to market opportunities and customer challenges that weren't addressable within our previous fragmented model. 4. The next hour, we explored these Phase 2 initiatives in detail. The enterprise security platform that had previously stalled for 18 months was now preparing for market release, incorporating breakthrough approaches developed by Elena Vega's cross-functional team. The Westfield architecture had evolved beyond its original technical specifications to include customer experience innovations that early adopters were describing as revolutionary. Most significant was the Quantum Integration Initiative, a moonshot project that had been considered technically unfeasible under Meridian's previous structure, but was now progressing rapidly through our collaborative innovation model. By connecting specialized expertise across traditionally separate domains, the initiative was developing quantum computing applications with practical business value rather than merely theoretical potential. Gerald joined me in the center to discuss this initiative, his technical brilliance now effectively integrated with strategic market vision. Our collaborative leadership had become a tangible embodiment of the transformation philosophy. Complementary strengths enhancing rather than competing with each other, creating outcomes neither could produce independently. The quantum integration prototype has achieved processing capabilities 3 generations beyond our initial projections, Gerald explained, his enthusiasm evident. But what's truly revolutionary is the practical application architecture, making quantum advantages accessible to business problems previously considered outside quantum domain. This represents exactly the integration effect we've been cultivating, I added. Not just connecting technical specializations, but bridging between theoretical possibility and practical application, between computational capability and genuine customer value. As the presentation concluded and leaders moved into breakout sessions focused on specific Phase 2 initiatives, I stepped outside briefly for a scheduled call with the board chairperson. The leadership transition we had implemented 3 months earlier had significantly recalibrated board dynamics, replacing 3 legacy members with directors bringing diverse industry perspectives and transformation experience. The quarterly package is impressive, Chairperson Diana Weatherford began when the call connected, particularly the cultural metrics underlying the performance outcomes. The transformation appears to be accelerating rather than plateauing. Integration effects compound over time, I explained. As collaborative capabilities develop, they create exponentially more connection points for innovation rather than merely linear improvement. The board is particularly interested in expansion potential, Diana continued. Whether this transformation model could be applied to acquisition targets or new market development. That's precisely our Phase 3 focus, I confirmed. The Quantum Integration Initiative includes pilot applications with 3 strategic partners in adjacent industries. These collaborations are creating blueprints for extending our transformation approach beyond Meridian's current boundaries. After completing the call, I rejoined the summit as breakout sessions were concluding. The energy remained high as leaders shared insights from their discussions, specific applications of our transformation principles to innovation challenges, implementation refinements based on first-phase learning, and cultural practices that were proving particularly effective in their respective areas. Elena Vega approached as the formal agenda transitioned to networking time. Her journey epitomized the potential unleashed by our transformation, rising from a systems architect, position routinely overlooked in the previous structure, to now leading Meridian's most strategic innovation initiative. The quantum integration partners are requesting accelerated engagement, she reported. Their early experience with the prototype has them convinced the approach creates substantial competitive advantage. They're seeking exclusive application rights in their respective industries. This market validation carried significance beyond the specific initiative. It confirmed that our transformation approach delivered value recognizable by sophisticated external partners, not just internal metrics improvements. Their enthusiasm is understandable, I acknowledged, though exclusivity would limit the broader ecosystem potential we've been developing. Let's discuss alternative partnership structures that preserve appropriate competitive advantages while enabling the network effects that drive exponential rather than linear outcomes. Elena nodded, understanding the strategic balance between immediate partner value and longer-term ecosystem development. I've been working with Thomas on financial models for various partnership configurations. His integrated approach to value creation metrics has been remarkably helpful in quantifying ecosystem benefits beyond traditional transaction economics. The mention of Thomas reflected his evolving role within Meridian's transformation. As financial strategist, he had developed innovative approaches to measuring integrated value creation. Frameworks that captured collaborative outcomes traditional financial metrics overlooked. His professional evolution paralleled developments in our personal relationship, with both domains showing consistent progress toward more integrated functioning. Our dinner conversation 3 months earlier had initiated a careful recalibration of relationship patterns. We had maintained a balanced approach, combining facilitated counseling sessions with direct interaction, gradually developing new interaction patterns based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical positioning. Thomas's individual growth had been particularly evident in his capacity to recognize and value perspectives different from his own, not just tolerating diverse viewpoints, but actively integrating them into more comprehensive understanding. This evolution manifested in both professional and personal contexts, suggesting genuine transformation rather than merely strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. As the summit activities continued around us, Gerald joined our conversation with updated technical specifications from the quantum integration prototype. The discussion that followed exemplified the leadership integration we had been cultivating: technical brilliance, Gerald; innovation application, Elena; financial valuation, Thomas, who had joined the group; and strategic orchestration, my contribution. Creating comprehensive understanding no single perspective could generate independently. When the formal summit concluded in late afternoon, Thomas and I had scheduled time to continue our ongoing relationship discussions. Rather than returning to his apartment and my house separately, we had established a pattern of regular conversations in neutral settings, continuing the careful renegotiation of relationship boundaries and possibilities. Today's discussion was scheduled at the Botanical Gardens, a setting that provided both privacy for meaningful conversation and inspirational surroundings conducive to expansive thinking. As we walked through the Japanese meditation section, our conversation reflected the integrated approach we had been developing: honest without being harsh, vulnerable without being fragile, direct without being defensive. The summit results were genuinely impressive, Thomas observed, particularly the correlation between cultural metrics and performance outcomes. The integrated leadership model is producing exactly the acceleration effect you hypothesized in your original transformation strategy. The results reflect consistent application of integration principles across multiple domains, I acknowledged. Structural, cultural, and leadership dimensions reinforcing rather than contradicting each other. We continued walking in comfortable silence, appreciating the carefully designed garden landscape. The meditation path led to a small pavilion overlooking a stream, a natural place to pause and engage more directly. "I've been reflecting on parallel patterns in our relationship development," Thomas said as we settled on the pavilion bench. "The counseling has helped me recognize how compartmentalization limited not just our connection, but my own growth. Maintaining artificial separations between professional and personal domains required constant energy that could have been directed toward genuine development." His observation aligned with insights from our recent sessions, though the independent articulation suggested integrated understanding rather than merely rehearsed acknowledgement. "The integration effect applies across all relationship dimensions," I noted. "When we maintain authentic connection rather than strategic positioning, the interaction creates possibilities neither person could generate independently." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "What's become increasingly clear is that our relationship challenges weren't simply about your hidden investment activities or my dismissive attitudes, though those patterns certainly existed. The deeper issue was our mutual participation in a fragmented relationship model that limited authentic connection and genuine growth for both of us." This framing represented significant evolution from his initial understanding, which had positioned the relationship breakdown primarily as consequence of my deception, rather than recognizing our shared participation in problematic patterns. The shift from blame allocation to pattern recognition indicated genuine growth in relationship maturity. "That recognition creates possibility for different configurations moving forward," I acknowledged. "Whether we ultimately rebuild our marriage or establish a different relationship model, the awareness provides foundation for more integrated connection." Thomas turned slightly to face me more directly. "After 6 months of exploration, I believe we have sufficient assessment data to make informed decisions rather than continue indefinite evaluation. The consistent patterns in both facilitated and direct interactions suggest capacity for sustainable new relationship configurations rather than merely temporary adjustments." The observation paralleled my own assessment, that while our relationship exploration had appropriately begun with careful structure and professional facilitation, continuing indefinite evaluation might actually limit authentic development rather than supporting it. At some point, genuine transformation required moving beyond assessment into committed implementation of new patterns. "I agree," I replied, "though we should recognize that any new configuration will require ongoing attention to pattern maintenance, not just initial recalibration." "Absolutely," Thomas affirmed. "Sustainable transformation requires consistent integration of awareness into behavior, not just intellectual recognition of patterns." The statement echoed my own observation from months earlier, suggesting genuine internalization rather than superficial acknowledgement. He continued with characteristic directness. "I've been considering a structured proposal for relationship reconfiguration. Not returning to previous patterns, but establishing new parameters based on mutual respect, authentic communication, and genuine partnership." "I'm open to exploring that possibility," I responded, "though with appropriate recognition of both progress made and vulnerabilities that remain." Transformation is neither instantaneous nor linear. It requires sustained commitment to integration, even when challenging. As our conversation continued, we outlined potential parameters for relationship reconfiguration, specific communication practices, explicit expectations regarding personal autonomy within partnership, and structured approaches to addressing inevitable pattern disruptions that would emerge during transition. The discussion wasn't about romantic reconciliation in conventional terms, but about potentially creating a fundamentally different relationship configuration, one based on integrated partnership rather than hierarchical positioning or compartmentalized functioning. Whether this reconfiguration would ultimately support rebuilding our marriage remained uncertain, but the exploration itself demonstrated remarkable growth beyond our previous interaction patterns. The sun began setting as we completed our circuit of the gardens, casting long shadows across the carefully maintained landscape. The visual metaphor wasn't lost on either of us. Illumination transitioning into new configurations, revealing different aspects of familiar terrain. Whatever specific configuration emerges, Thomas observed as we approached the garden exit, I'm grateful for the growth this process has catalyzed, professionally and personally. The integrated approach you've championed at Meridian has transformed not just the organization, but my understanding of effective functioning across all domains. The acknowledgement carried no hint of strategic positioning or attempted ingratiation, simply authentic recognition of meaningful development. My response reflected similar integration between professional assessment and personal appreciation. The transformation journey continues in all domains, I noted, with ongoing commitment to integration rather than fragmentation, to authentic engagement rather than strategic positioning, to genuine partnership rather than hierarchical arrangement. As we parted ways in the parking area, Thomas returning to his apartment to develop the relationship reconfiguration proposal he had mentioned, me heading to an evening strategy session with Artemis's leadership team, the parallel transformation journeys continued unfolding. Organizational and personal domains remained distinct but interconnected, each informing the other through consistent application of the same fundamental principle. Whatever specific outcomes emerged in either domain, the underlying truth had been consistently validated. Authentic transformation isn't about changing external arrangements, but about integrating previously fragmented aspects of our experience, creating wholeness where artificial separation had limited potential and constrained genuine expression. That integration, whether in corporate leadership, personal development, or intimate relationships, creates expansion of possibilities beyond what fragmented functioning can ever produce. 1 year after my revelation at the dinner party, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel, facing an audience of 700 women attending the inaugural Women in Leadership Summit. The event, co-sponsored by Artemis Investment Collective and Meridian Technologies, had sold out within 48 hours of announcement, a testament to the hunger for authentic dialogue about transformation in both organizations and individual careers. Welcome to a conversation about possibility, I began, surveying the diverse gathering of executives, entrepreneurs, investors, and emerging leaders. Not the carefully curated success stories that dominate most leadership conferences, but honest exploration of transformation, its challenges, its unexpected turns, and its extraordinary potential to create expansion beyond conventional boundaries. The energy in the room was palpable, a blend of anticipation, recognition, and readiness for substantive engagement rather than motivational platitudes. These women hadn't come for superficial inspiration, but for authentic dialogue about navigating complex realities with strategic wisdom and personal integrity. My journey from just a housewife to revealed strategist has generated countless headlines and case studies over the past year, I acknowledged. Most focus on the dramatic revelation moment or the quantifiable outcomes that followed. But the headlines miss the deeper pattern that matters most: how integration creates possibilities, that fragmentation can never produce. For the next 30 minutes, I shared the authentic story behind the media narratives, not the sanitized version emphasizing triumphant emergence, but the complex reality of navigating between societal constraints and personal choices, between strategic patience and authentic expression, between systematic transformation and inevitable human messiness. The transformation that began with my emergence as Artemis's principal has produced extraordinary outcomes across multiple domains, I explained. Meridian's market value has increased 74%. The Quantum Integration Initiative is revolutionizing practical quantum applications across 3 industries. Our talent retention metrics have reached unprecedented levels, particularly among women and minorities in technical roles. I paused, making eye contact with various sections of the audience before continuing. But these outcomes, impressive as they are, represent merely the visible manifestations of a more fundamental transformation. What matters most isn't what we've accomplished, but how we've accomplished it. Through integration rather than fragmentation. Through collaborative strength rather than competitive positioning. Through authentic engagement rather than strategic manipulation. The summit agenda that followed embodied this philosophy, not celebrity keynotes delivering rehearsed inspiration, but substantive dialogue among diverse leaders, exploring transformation from multiple perspectives. Panel discussions featured executives from varied industries alongside emerging leaders with fresh viewpoints. Workshop sessions created structured collaboration across traditional boundaries of seniority, industry, and functional expertise. During the midday networking session, I circulated among conversation clusters, engaging directly rather than maintaining the careful distance typical of featured speakers. These interactions revealed the real impact of our transformation story, not just professional admiration but personal recognition. Women seeing aspects of their own experiences reflected in different dimensions of our journey. Your story validated something I've felt but couldn't articulate, shared an operations executive from a manufacturing firm. The artificial separation between strategic capability and nurturing capacity, as if integrating both somehow diminishes rather than enhances effectiveness. What resonated most wasn't the revelation drama, observed a technical founder transitioning to CEO role, but your systematic approach to transformation, recognizing patterns across professional and personal domains, then strategically recalibrating, rather than reactively disrupting. These conversations continued throughout lunch and into the afternoon sessions, revealing how our specific experience had catalyzed broader reflection about transformation possibilities across diverse contexts. The summit wasn't creating this energy but channeling it, providing structured space for dialogue that women had been seeking but rarely finding in traditional leadership forums. During a brief break between sessions, I stepped onto the hotel's rooftop garden for a scheduled call with Artemis's investment committee. The expansion strategy we had been developing was entering implementation phase, applying our transformation methodology beyond Meridian to portfolio companies across 3 sectors. The Singapore partnership has formalized, reported Lucia Chen, Artemis's strategic development director. Their investment committee approved the full funding package for the Asian expansion initiative. They're particularly interested in the cultural integration methodology that produced such significant results at Meridian. Excellent progress, I acknowledged. Have they confirmed leadership participation in the knowledge transfer sessions? Full executive committee plus their top 30 emerging leaders, Lucia confirmed. They recognize this isn't merely structural reorganization, but fundamental recalibration of how leadership functions across cultural contexts. As we finalized implementation timelines, I noticed Elena Vega entering the garden area with a tablet, displaying real-time data from the quantum integration prototype. Her expression suggested significant developments that couldn't wait for our scheduled update the following day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.